Okay, so as I put this together, I realized that going all the way from 10 to 2021 was too much for one night. So we're going to do about half of it. It all begins in 1910. And in order to get going in this, I'm going to give you the identification which we're using on the historical website that a bunch of us have agreed to. So you'll see the code up at the top, and every badge has the same type of code. So the first 2 or 3 indicators are about the particular office, like ASM for Assistant Scout Master, SM, so forth and so on. The 2 Ys are whether it's a badge or a hat pin or collar brass or yada, yada, yada. Then the first number is the century, the next number is the decade, and then the sequence of the badges inside that decade. So just keep that in mind as you go along, because if you go to the website later to see this stuff, it's all done like that. So here's an example. ASM HP-1-1-1 is an Assistant Scout Master hat pin in the 1910 and 1919 period, and it's the first in the series. That's the way the numbering works. So let's dive in. 1910, the first insignia for Scoutmasters happens, and it happens to be a white metal hat plume worn on the hat at the time. If we take a look at one of those, this is what the plume looks like. It's a single bar in the center. You'll find a lot of them that have 3 bars. That's not the right one. And it has no stars. You'll find a bunch of them with stars, and it needs a red plume. So there are only 3 of these in 10. You had a red one, a green one, and a blue one. You had a Scoutmaster, Assistant Scoutmaster, and Commissioner. And it was only used for a very short period of time, up until sometime in the spring of 11 is when this thing was used. Starting in sometime in 11, we get these red first-class emblems with a brown eagle for Assistant Scoutmaster. Other colors for other positions. Green for Scoutmaster, white for Troop Committee, so forth and so on. We're going to focus on the red. It was about 75 to 80 millimeters tall. It varied in height, and you can see the front and the back. Except it's not as simple as it was red, because there are lots of variations. And I'm going to give you all of the variations, okay? It's a little overwhelming, but as a historian, my job is to tell you what's out there, and you can decide what you want to do with it. So the very first ones, you'll notice that the head points 90 degrees to the left. The stars are what we call a single layer versus the next series, which is a double, and you can see that. You can see the embroidery angle. You can see that in the scroll top, it's a double curve. We'll see other curves in a few minutes. It's open-ended on the scroll versus being closed-ended. And all of them have 5 feathers on the tail for the most part. And all adult badges, for the most part, have 5 red stripes in the shield. So the very first series, this is what they look like. The next series, they changed the angle here on the embroidery, and they doubled the stars. So you've got an outer star and an inner and a star on top of it. You still have the double curve, and you still have the open scrolls. It's 2 of the variations that are out there. And we know these were used between 11 and 15 because of the direction of the head and the shape of the curve. Then around 1916, things changed. The head got a little bit of an angle to it. And most importantly, the scroll changed its shape. The top of the scroll went to a single curve rather than the double curve. We still have the open ends. We still have the same angle on embroidery. Then along about 1918, we had another change. They closed the ends of the scroll, which have a little bit of embroidery here on the end, as you can see. Redid the angles again, going back to the other directions, and they went back to the single stars with the head being at a real tilted angle. So that's 4, but we're not done yet. So around 1917 or 1918, an embroiderer made an error. And instead of grabbing the pattern for the adult size badge, they grabbed the pattern for the youth size badge and embroidered it like an Assistant Scoutmaster. It is red, just like the others, except it only has 3 tail feathers and 1, 2, 3, 4 stripes of red in the shield. It's got the double layered stars and the closed end. But the biggest way to tell these is that's about how they look in size. It is really small compared to the standard Assistant Scout Master badge. If you're going to collect, I will tell you this little thing is a bear to find. So that's the badges that were used on uniforms in that time period, with the exception of also available were armbands. Now, we don't know how many varieties they actually made in these armbands. We suspect all of them. It's the same badge just sewn onto an armband. They're available, listed in the catalog. They're to be worn over a uniform or a scout jacket sleeve. And the reasons for the armbands are pretty straightforward. You didn't have to buy multiple badges. If you had a Mackinac code, or if you had a Norfolk code, and if you had a uniform, you just changed your armband. Or when you were about to wash your uniform, you could take the armband off so that your colors didn't fade in your emblem, and you could keep your emblem in good condition. Remember, we're talking about times when a lot of the stuff that adults and our youth wore were made of metal, so they could take it off to launder. And if you think about laundering in those days, the laundry detergents and the laundry methods were not quite as fabric friendly as they are today. In a lot of cases, you see badges that are completely faded out. Or I have a beautiful commissioner badge that has all of the beautiful blue and white of the badge, and the material that's supposed to be khaki or tan or whatever you want to call it is almost white. Okay, so that's the embroidered side of what was available from 11 to 20. But let's talk about the other insignia that adults wore, and that is hat badges. So in late 1917, it was announced that adults could wear hat badges as an official part of their uniform to identify their position on their hat. These things were 38 millimeters and tall, or about 1.5 inches without the wire, and the colors matched the colors of the badge. But again, there are variations. In December of 17 to sometime in early spring, when they ran out, the first ones that came into the office were gold with red, but that was an error. They were supposed to be silver with red. So once the initial few ran out, all of the others came in and they were silver with red. And you can see that there are two different findings on the back. One is the post finding with the big nut, and the other finding is the bullet class. If you go looking for these, you're most likely going to find the last one with the bullet class. That is the most common of all of them. The gold one is extremely rare. So now let's get into the 1920 to the 1937 period. This is the green background with the gold eagle. It's the squatty crown is what we're going to start with. And you'll notice that what's supposed to be happening on the back of these is the black copyright protection imprint lasted on these until 36. And then the Boy Scouts basically had run everybody else out of business. So they started to save some money by not having the cloth manufacturer actually print on the side of the cloth. That saved scouting a huge amount of money on the uniform cloth. So again, it's not as simple as there's a green one background with a gold eagle. So in 1920, when they first came out, you have two. Now, if you're looking at these, you'll start to notice that he probably had Wested two embroiderers that he was bouncing back and forth with, and probably horse racing pricing. So this first one, you'll see the double curve, but it has an open-ended scroll, and the embroidery is going in this direction, okay? It has a blue eye. That's an important thing to notice. And it's single layered stars. And the eagle's head points 90 degrees to the left. The other one, at the same time, probably the other manufacturer, has the single curve and sweep in the scroll, open-ended again, same direction on the, whatever these two little tips that stick out are. I don't know what the official name is for them. And the eagle's head is going in that left direction with a blue eye. And I keep pointing out the blue eye because we're going to see some variation in a moment. Okay, so that's 20 and 21. In 22 and 23, we now go to a closed-ended, and we have the double sweep on the roll, and we still have the blue eye. We still have the single stars. The change here is the closed end on the scroll. Everything else pretty much stays the same. And then lo and behold, one of the embroiderers decided that instead of a blue eye, it would be, for some reason, advantageous to have a white eye. So we have the white eye badge, which is pretty much the same, except this particular manufacturer changed the embroidery direction. So here you see the embroidery direction is pretty much running through the top of the scroll, always in the same direction, kind of up and down, a bit left and right. On this particular badge with the white eye, it starts running in kind of a radial direction. So obviously very distinct, different patterns to make these two badges. Now you'll see these numbers up at the top. This is number 3. This is number 5. You'll see number 4 here in a minute. So then we go from this to these two. Now we go back to the blue eye. The head is still pointing out to the right. We have the radial, but we have double stars now versus the single stars. So a change in the pattern again. And then this change in this pattern is, and the other part of this pattern is the embroidery now for the center. Notice on these, they're angled in this direction and this direction. Here they switched with the white eye, and now they've gone to the blue eye, and they match this direction with the kind of radial. Again, closed-ended. And then the last one is they go back to the single layered stars. Lots of variation in that. Now, also during this time period, you were able to order out of the catalog either 6-ounce serge cloth, which is a very lightweight, very thin, kind of fuzzy cloth, or you could order the 14-ounce woolen melon cloth, which is a really dense cloth, 1/8 of an inch thick kind of stuff, meant to be worn on the heavy wool uniforms, the Mackinac and so forth. So these are the two different fabrics. These happened all through the time period that all of these variations were being made. You could order serge and you could order melon. We haven't found all of them on the different cloths, but we're continuing to find some now and then. Also during this time period, of course, you could order armbands as an item, and all of the different badges, all the different variations were available on armbands. We have seen several of them. I'm just giving you an example here of an armband. So that's the embroidered insignia from 20 to 37. But also during this same time period, you could wear a hat pin on your campaign hat to identify your position. And there are 5 known hat pins. And there's variation between each of these. I'll give you an enlargement here. So the first one, the dates on these are wrong. I'm sorry, I got to put the right dates on. These are all between 20 and 28. So on the very first one in the early 20s, the first one that came out had 5 stars in the shield. The stars are kind of thick, and down where at the bottom of the scroll, there's a little triangle where the knot is attaching. The second one, which came out, had this cutout in it, which is the way you tell that one. The third one that came out is different in that the stars are look more normal, like starlight. But importantly, it had a circle here, which is the way you tell that one, where the wire or the cast wire actually is, it's simulated as going through. Then the fourth one, we've got normal stars, but we're back to that little triangle at the bottom. And then the last one is got the fat stars, but there's only 4 stars in the shield. And again, these went from 1920 to 1928. And these are the 5 varieties that we've been able to find. Could there be a 6th or a 7th? Yes, there could be. And I encourage you, if you have something that is different than one of these, please let us know. Now, in 1928, hat pins were discontinued, and we changed from hat pins to collar brass. So instead of wearing the metal hat badge on your hat, you now wore the metal badge on your collar. You wore 2, one on each collar. And from 28 to 32, the badge looked like this, 24 millimeters with the wire, very narrow for wings on the treefold. In 32 to 36, we had a wide wing on the treefold, and it was a couple of millimeters larger. We do know that there are green enamel shade variations. We have no intent to categorize those shade variations because there are lots of them. There was very little true consistency in color. As long as it was about this green or green, it was okay and it got shipped. So in 1937, the design of all scouting badges changed and they went to tall crown. And here is the tall crown version. As far as we know, there's only one version of this. It has that center line in the crown that none of the others have. And along with that, they changed the collar brass to match. Now you'll note that this one is silver, a Scoutmaster one. I don't own an Assistant Scoutmaster. This thing is incredibly tough to find. So if anybody out there happens to have a green and gold one, I'd love to talk to you about it. So that's the 37 collar brass. Then the collar brass changes when we go into the rounds. So now in 1938 and 39, we went to the round badge. And the very first ones were made out of silk embroidery. Now you'll notice the easiest way to tell silk ones is if you look at the back, there is no white or black bobbin thread. Here is one with white and black bobbin thread. You can see the little white lines running all behind it. It's kind of like a sewing machine does. The very first silk ones did not have that. And these only lasted for about a year, year and a half, because in 1939, the Boy Scouts of America issued a letter to all of their embroiderers stating they had to discontinue using silk and transition to cotton because of the conflict in Asia. So around 1939, 1940, the badges changed to cotton. So this is the 1940 to 42 version on lightweight uniform cloth. And you can see this one has white threads on the back. It's possible that instead of the white threads on the back, there could be black, but I haven't seen one of those surface as of yet. A lot of the rank insignia and a lot of the adult position insignia have black bobbin threads on the back. Then in 1940, around 42, 43, we were heavily into the war. Things became difficult to get. Uniform cloth became hard to find. And this is when fine twill cloth is introduced. And you'll find a lot of badges on fine twill. We have never found the Assistant Scoutmaster on fine twill, but we have found it on the other cloth that was used during the war. And instead of the standard cloth, which you can see over in the right lower, there is something called war cloth. And you can see the weave is very different in this particular cloth for this badge. These are not common, and most of the ones you find are very well used. But it does exist. It's a different cloth. It has a slightly different color to it. Everything else is identical. Use the same embroidery pattern as the previous badge, just on a different cloth. Then in 46, we transitioned to, after the war, to the post-war cloth. And this is the one that you see the most in this kind of Assistant Scoutmaster badge. You see lots of these out there because it lasted for quite a few years from 46 to 64. So in 65 to 66, this little round thing came out with a marrowed edge, what some people call a rolled edge. Embroiderers call it a marrowed edge. There were two versions of it. Twill is different. You've got a coarse twill and a medium twill. And if you don't want to know what that really means is if you simply count the number of rows, like from this edge to this embroidery, on this one you might find, I think it's around 7. On this one, you'll find like 9. It's because the weave here is using a finer thread and they're putting more rows per inch. And this kind of stuff, and for most of us, we just consider this stuff MVE, the manufacturing variation, but I'm letting you guys know it's out there. So the other thing, again, is from 38 to 66 is the collar brass that was used during this time period. So you've got 5 essentially different pieces of collar brass. Fronts are pretty much all the same. You know, you've got stamping variation. When they recast or redid the die, there's minor variations, but nothing that is worth describing. The real differences are the backs and the findings and the metal. So pre-war in 38 to 43, you used a standard brass with kind of a safety pin finding. During the war, brass was used for ammunition. So there wasn't a whole lot of it around. So they actually made the scouting badges out of sterling and then plated them so that they looked like brass. Because sterling was readily available and cheap during the war because nobody wanted it. Everybody wanted brass for ammunition. So you can see, of course, because it's sterling, it has to be stamped. You have the finding going in one direction, horizontal and or vertical. We consider the difference between those simply MBE and the collecting, but both of those are stamped sterling. And then post-war, you're back to the brass. You have the finding that is the standard spin wheel class. And then in the late 60s, you get to the double posted. And that is the history of insignia for Assistant Scoutmaster between 10 and 66. But it's not as easy as collecting a red one and a green one and a round one, although that could be a perfectly good collection. So thank you very much. And I'll turn it back over to Johnny.
Well, that was awesome. Any questions for Ron?
Yes, I have some comments.
Yes.
Thank you very much. The red embroidered insignia that you showed, let's say I'm going to label it 1, 2, and 3. Actually, 3 should be 1 and 1 should be 3 in that order. The small one should be the first one, okay? And the reason 2 should stay 2 is because on the smile at the beginning, the end points were straight. They later did a fancy swirl to it, okay? Now, the second thing I want to talk about is those first hat pins, those big hat pins.
Mhm.
They did the gold one first,
Yep.
but they didn't like it. There was 2 things wrong with it. On the smile, there was no wall, so the enameling rolled over it. They corrected it when they did the silver one and they built the wall. They also corrected something else that you really can't see here. On top of the eagle's head, there's an extra feather on the back of his head by that pointed stem going up there. They didn't like it. They took it off when they did the silver ones. So they did more than 2 changes on it, but those are the 2 changes. They built a wall here so the enamel wouldn't flow over. And on top of the head, there's an extra feather. I have all of them. I have all 6 of them. And in each one they have that extra feather they took off. And all of them have no wall here. So they added the wall. So those are the difference between those 2. When you strike something with a die, you make enough of them, the die wears down.
Mhm.
And so the front part becomes, messy, not distinctive.
Yeah, the
Well-
most common thing that wears is the stars in the shield. If it's a new early die, the stars are beautiful. But as that die wears, those stars become dots.